Dr. Tana will be our next speaker and last one before our kind of open Q&A, which we may truncate just a little bit to try to stay more on schedule. But I also want to encourage you that as our doctors leave and they're out in the hallway, please feel free to interact with them. They're here for you. Dr. Tana is our next speaker. As I said, she's from UCSF, and a very prestigious university, so we're really lucky that she has come. She has interest in autoimmune liver disease, but more specifically, she completed an NIH fellowship, actually, and this had special interest then at fatigue, and the fatigue that typically comes along with chronic liver disease. And I think this afternoon, Dr. Tana will talk about fatigue in the breakout sessions as well. She's also she's a new collaborator of ours here at IU and a part of the GRACE study. That Dr. Tana is leading some of the genetic work at UCSF of some of our enrolled patients. So if you join me in welcoming Dr. Tana. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you all so much for inviting me to speak here. I'm really pleased to be a part of this conference. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the talk. I'll keep it short and sweet because I know this is the last one before lunch. So the title of my talk is Clinical Outcomes of Autoimmune Hepatitis. All AIH is not the same. So that's a theme that Craig had mentioned earlier, and you guys will see that in the talk. Now let's see, where do I point this? There we go. Okay, so our aims for this talk are to chat about clinical outcomes in general and for autoimmune hepatitis. Then we're going to review some pertinent research studies on clinical outcomes in autoimmune hepatitis. We'll talk about the predictors of these outcomes in autoimmune hepatitis, and we'll also talk about what predictor variables are. And then we'll close by talking about areas for further research. So clinical outcomes are basically any meaningful disease-related event in the course of a patient's illness. So here's some examples of outcomes that are most important to patients. Survival, right? So we have here mortality. People talk about 5-year survival, 10-year survival. In the context of autoimmune hepatitis, we often talk about transplant-free survival, or basically a combo outcome of liver transplantation or death, because that's considered, your liver dying. So we combine those oftentimes in studies. Other morbid events are often considered clinical outcomes. So like strokes or heart attacks, or in autoimmune hepatitis, decompensating events. You've heard people talk about cirrhosis being either compensated or decompensated, and so the typical decompensating events are things like confusion or fluid in the belly, liver cancer, etc. Then there are caregiver-reported outcomes, so including caregiver burden, and then patient-reported outcomes, which Dr. Muhammad talked about, and others too, symptoms and feelings that the patients experience, such as fatigue. So, we talk about clinical outcomes, and in research studies, we talk about outcome variables, or basically different outcomes that we want to study. And so in this schematic, that would be the outcome variable here. And then also in these research studies, we talk about predictor variables. Or you might hear the terms like independent variable and dependent variable. So the predictor variables are things that we want to study that we think might influence or be associated with the outcome variable. And, that might be something like age or sex, or and then the outcome variables, as we discussed. You might have a particular thing you want to study that's like your predictor variable of interest, and then but you might also want to look at other moderating, modifying other influencing factors, and so you could call those moderators, and so that's kind of depicted here. So, like, for instance, in some of our research that we've been doing at UCSF, we've been interested in race as a predictor variable for various outcomes, but we want to adjust for moderating variables like age and sex, for instance. So again, clinical outcomes in autoimmune hepatitis that are of interest are things like treatment response. So are people responding completely and achieving this complete remission, or are they not responding, or is it a partial remission? So that could be an outcome of interest. We talked about liver transplantation and survival, as well as those decompensating events, right? GI bleeding or encephalopathy, confusion, et cetera, and HCC, the main type of liver cancer. Other clinical outcomes that have been studied are like successful withdrawal of therapy. So we've heard today that therapy for autoimmune hepatitis is generally indefinite, but there have been studies looking at withdrawal of therapy and who can be successfully withdrawn from therapy. So successful withdrawal of therapy would be like an outcome of interest, and then in these studies, people have looked for predictors of that kind of successful withdrawal. But of course, the caveat is that there's a lot of data saying that for the most part, maintenance therapy is lifelong and should always be continued. And then we talked about fatigue as a potential outcome of interest. So this is just a graph from a study of a large Swedish cohort looking at age of deaths in their cohort, comparing men and women. And so you can see here that there wasn't a big difference in the time of death for the male AIH patients and the female AIH patients, but it seemed that the timing was more evenly distributed for men, whereas most of the women, the majority of the women died in their 8th decade of life, you could say. And so in that same Swedish cohort, they looked at, again, this composite outcome of transplant-free survival. So, who died or needed a liver transplant and when. They compared men and women, and they did not find a statistically significant difference between men and women in this study. So this was a study by Verma et al. That came out of Maryland and sort of the Johns Hopkins area, looking at poor outcomes in patients with autoimmune hepatitis. And so, they had defined another one of these composite outcomes. It wasn't just death or liver transplantation, but they also included like jaundice and hospitalization. So what they found was that in their cohort, the black patients had worse outcomes compared to the white patients. And, it wasn't like a really complex analysis. They did, they created these curves and then compared them using a log rank test. So it wasn't adjusted for those other moderating variables that we had talked about. So not perfect by any means. And then this is sort of a forest plot, we call it, of results from a study that we did at UCSF. Jason Wen was a medical student who has been working with us. And we used data from this large national data set called the National Inpatient Sample, or NIS. And so that is a publicly available database published by the AHRQ. What is that? I want to say American Health Research and Quality. I don't think that's the exact acronym, but AHRQ publishes this data set of all hospitalizations, inpatient hospitalizations in the United States, and they gather that data every year and then release it slowly. So we had the data set from 2008 to 2012, and during that time period, there were over 1,000, like about 1,300 hospitalizations for autoimmune hepatitis, so with like a primary discharge diagnosis of autoimmune hepatitis. And within that data set, you can also see, you have information about those hospitalizations, including the age, sex, race, insurance, et cetera, of the patients hospitalized, and also whether or not they died within that hospitalization. So it's like inpatient mortality. And so we did this analysis looking at which of the predictor variables or different factors were associated with death during hospitalizations for autoimmune hepatitis. And so, even after correcting for age, sex, insurance, sort of kind of place that they lived in, whether it was a large city or a rural area, we also corrected for income based on their zip code and the region of the United States, as well as presence or absence of cirrhosis. We found that Black race was independently associated with worse survival during autoimmune hepatitis hospitalizations. This is a study. The primary author was Daniel Kim, I think, and this study came out of LA, so sort of the Los Angeles County, very similar actually to the place where I work, because I work at the county hospital in San Francisco. So this is like the county hospital in Los Angeles. And they looked at their autoimmune hepatitis cohort, which is largely composed of underserved Latino patients, again, similar to the patients that I see. And what they found was, again, doing one of these Kaplan-Meier curves, they found that looking at the composite endpoint of death or liver transplantation, patients with primary care did better in terms of this composite outcome, and patients without primary care had worse outcomes, and that was statistically significant, but again, not adjusted for all these other potentially modifying variables. So this is a study that was a collaboration of investigators and centers in Sweden, and the first author was Werner. They used the acronym SILK for their collaboration, and so they have a very, like many of these Scandinavian countries, they have a very tight control and monitoring of people, all the people in their country, and when they die and the cause of death. And so they had a large cohort of autoimmune hepatitis patients, and they compared the survival in autoimmune hepatitis patients to that of the general Swedish population. And to be fair, they also counted liver transplantation as a death in that study. So they found that there was a statistically significant difference in survival between the AIH patients and the controls, but it only became apparent after several years after the diagnosis. But overall, I would say that, as other speakers have said, prognosis is generally very good in autoimmune hepatitis. So that same group also looked at initial treatment response as a predictor of survival in autoimmune hepatitis. And so when you split up the patients by their response as, and to sort of define response in this study, they looked at the ALT after 1 year of therapy. And so they divided their patients into those who had a complete remission, a partial response. So remission would be like normal ALT. Partial response would be after a year of therapy, ALT between 1 and 5 times the upper limit of normal, so not quite normal. And then no response would be an ALT that's greater than 5 times that upper limit of normal at 1 year. And the patients who had this was statistically significant with basically your response to treatment predicting the outcome of death or liver transplantation. So again, this is why we want to treat autoimmune hepatitis and get the transaminases as normal as possible. And so this is also from that SILK cohort, again, looking at outcomes, in this case, death or liver transplantation, now comparing patients who had cirrhosis at diagnosis, which is, versus those who did not. And so we've already heard today, and you guys are all probably familiar, that cirrhosis is the most advanced stage of liver scarring. So the whole liver is filled up with scar tissue at the time of diagnosis. And so in this cohort, they've found, and others too, that patients with cirrhosis generally have worse outcomes. Also, some other interesting findings from this paper were that a markedly elevated ALT at the time of diagnosis was actually associated with a lower risk of subsequent death or liver transplantation. But they did not find a significant relationship between gender or jaundice at presentation and then subsequent outcome. And so, you could say that an acute hepatitis-like onset with intact synthetic function indicated good response to treatment and favorable long-term prognosis. So basically, when they're saying hepatitis-like, they mean that the transaminases, the AST and ALT liver enzymes being very high, and then when they say intact synthetic function, those are the like the INR and the albumin and the bilirubin. So those lab tests that indicate how the liver is synthesizing or making various proteins, which John talked about in his talk. So those things at the time of presentation indicated that patients would go on to do pretty well, respond to therapy, and have less of a need for liver transplantation. And that's pretty interesting, because you might think, well, the high transaminases, that's a bad sign. But actually, in this study, it's not so much the level of the transaminases as much as how well the liver is synthesizing proteins and functioning by those true liver function tests. And they also, in this study, they were able to do a multivariable analysis where they were able to correct for those other factors. And they found that age at diagnosis, the elevated INR, and low ALT were actually associated with worse outcomes. And again, that elevated INR is a sign that the liver's not making those clotting proteins as well. So this was a large study from Hanover, Germany, where there are some very renowned experts in autoimmune hepatitis. And so this is, again, showing a comparison of outcomes, namely survival or liver transplant-free survival in patients with and without cirrhosis. So basically on the y-axis here, they call it cumulative survival, but it's sort of 100% or 1 down to 0. And on the x-axis on these graphs is time. So initially, at the start of a period of follow-up, no one has experienced the outcome. No one has died. No one has needed a liver transplant. But as time goes on, people either experience the outcome or they drop out of the study. And so that's sort of why the lines fall this way. But in green is the patients who did have cirrhosis at the time of diagnosis. And the blue line is patients who didn't have cirrhosis. So again, this is sort of demonstrating what others have alluded to, which is that that's an important predictor. Whether or not you have cirrhosis is an important predictor of long-term outcomes. And this is also from that German group in Hanover, and they had, over 350 patients, and they did another analysis where they split the patients up into age at diagnosis, but they drew the cutoff at age 18. So it's like people who have childhood onset autoimmune hepatitis versus adult onset autoimmune hepatitis. And they did find a statistically significant difference in, again, this sort of composite outcome of no death or liver transplant, where, in green are the adults, and they generally did better or had better outcomes, and whereas the people diagnosed as children had worse outcomes. So then we'll move on to the studies that I mentioned about treatment withdrawal. So this was a study by Montana Losa and colleagues, and they basically had, I want to say, like under 100 patients in their total cohort, and those were AIH patients who were withdrawn from therapy, and most of them relapsed, meaning the medication, the azathioprine was stopped, and then, in 70% of these patients, the disease came back, but in a smaller percentage, about 30%, they had a sustained remission after the therapy was withdrawn. And then they looked at, well, what are the predictors of people who can come off the maintenance medication and still sustain that remission, and they found that a lower AST, a lower gamma globulin, and a lower IgG level were found in the patients who were able to sort of keep their disease in check even without the medication. And similarly, another study by Hartle et al., I think it came out in the Journal of Hepatology a few years ago, did a similar look at what predicts success of treatment withdrawal, and it was ALT and IgG level. So also sort of supporting that we should shoot for as low an ALT and low an IgG level as possible with our therapy. Not necessarily aiming to withdraw therapy, but if you are going to try to withdraw your maintenance therapy at some point, it's much better to have a low ALT and a low IgG value at the time of withdrawal. And of course, I don't know if this was mentioned by other speakers, but others would also recommend doing a liver biopsy before withdrawing the therapy to get a sense of what's going on in the liver. Is there any ongoing inflammation that we might not be able to pick up on through blood tests? So this is a rundown of the different predictors that I talked about today. So age at diagnosis is one. It seems, I think it's mixed, right? It seems like outcomes are maybe worse in people who are diagnosed as children, or if they're diagnosed later in life, perhaps. Sex is kind of, it's unclear. I think there's some evidence that men might have worse outcomes, but it's not totally clear yet. Race, I do think that people, and I'm probably biased because of some of our research that we've done, but I do think that people of color tend to have worse outcomes in autoimmune hepatitis. Certainly cirrhosis at presentation is a big one, and we have to be really careful with the patients that we diagnose and who already have cirrhosis at the time of presentation or diagnosis. Access to primary care, perhaps, or maybe that's a complex thing, but that may play into the time when a patient is diagnosed or how long the disease goes undiagnosed if you don't have primary care. Treatment response certainly does, I think, influence subsequent outcomes, and that's why we were all shooting to get the transaminases and the IgG levels nice and low. And then the way that people present, acute, we've heard a little bit about acute AIH, and then and also the function of the liver at the time of presentation. I think that's really important, but again, it kind of ties back into the cirrhosis. So only when you've got pretty advanced cirrhosis or maybe a fulminant presentation, then you're going to get some synthetic dysfunction. But those things also seem to play a role and predict subsequent outcomes. Other things that I didn't go into but have been mentioned in other talks are these autoantibodies. Perhaps this one soluble liver antigen might portend a poorer prognosis, and we should maybe monitor those patients more carefully. And then HLA alleles have also been brought up. And there's some evidence that people with this particular variant of the DRB1 gene may actually respond to treatment better and have better outcomes, as we say. So what are the areas that we should focus on for future research? These are just a few thoughts. Certainly, what kinds of interventions can we provide for our patients who have autoimmune hepatitis and cirrhosis? And that, of course, is sort of where we're all moving towards, is like, what can we do or intervene on? And then other areas of interest would be wide. What's the reasoning behind why certain people, like the people of color, have worse outcomes? Is it the access to care, genetics, the type of disease that they have, or is it something else? Also, what determines treatment response? That certain patients are going to respond to standard therapy, and others are going to need second-line therapy. It's very complex, and as Craig was saying, each patient is different. But sort of piecing together all the different factors involved, I think, would be helpful. And then we talked about how gender and age could be explored more, and it's not completely clear, I don't think, from the literature how that influences subsequent outcomes, as well as autoantibodies and HLA types. So if you all are interested in participating, you know about the GRACE study that Craig and the folks here at IU are running. And then, as he mentioned, we actually got a grant from the AASLD, the Liver Society of America, to do this study looking at gene expression in autoimmune hepatitis patients. And we're basically comparing the expression of genes in the blood of patients with autoimmune hepatitis to healthy controls. And ultimately, we plan to look at this gene expression as a predictor of these clinical outcomes that we talked about today. And so, to summarize, all AIH is not the same. There's several different clinical outcomes that can be studied and have been studied in autoimmune hepatitis, and there's a variety of experiences for any one of these given outcomes. And there are lots of different predictors that can be looked at as being associated with these outcomes. And it seems to me that we do need more research on these outcomes, because they help us understand the disease and reveal ways that we can help patients and improve the care for all of the AIH patients. So I want to thank Craig and all the IU faculty and staff, the AIHA, you guys, the members, staff, and all the volunteers, as well as the patients that are here and also back in San Francisco. And I think we'll have a group session for questions. So thank you very much.